time to maneuver away from them. And then they filled the windscreen as if it were a Hitchcock film. And this was a large flock of large birds. The species Canada geese, they weigh 8 or 10, sometimes 12 pounds. They have 5 foot or 6 foot wingspans. And they struck the airplane along the leading edges of the wings, the nose, and into the center, the core of both jet engines. Now, jet engines are turbines. They're finely balanced machinery spinning at tens of thousands of revolutions per minute, and having a 10-pound object or two go through each of them in the center, the core of the engine, is incredibly damaging and disruptive. Immediately I could hear terrible noises from the machinery being damaged I'd never heard in an airplane before. I could feel terrible vibrations I'd never felt in an airplane before. And then I received confirmation of what I believed had happened when I could smell coming into the cabin air the burning bird odor from the engines. And then the thrust loss was sudden, complete, symmetrical bilaterally, both engines at once. It felt as if the bottom had fallen out of our world. And my body responded immediately in a very normal human way to this sudden life-threatening stress. I was aware of that as it happened. I could feel my pulse shoot up, my blood pressure spike, my perceptual field narrow in tunnel vision because of the stress. I remember vividly my first 3 conscious thoughts. This can't be happening. Having read about many accident flights, a very typical response rooted in disbelief, followed immediately by, this doesn't happen to me. In other words, for over 4 decades, I had never been so challenged in an airplane I doubted the outcome. Followed immediately by a realization that unlike all those other flights I'd had for 42 years, this one probably would not end on a runway with the aircraft undamaged. And I was okay with that, as long as I could solve the problem. And so even though we'd never trained for this, in flight simulators of the airline, it was not possible to practice a water landing. They aren't programmed for it. The only training we'd ever gotten for a water landing was a theoretical classroom discussion. But because I had learned my craft so well, I knew my airplane and my profession so intimately, I could set clear priorities. And so I chose to do only the highest priority items. And then I had the discipline to ignore everything I did not have time to do as being only distractions and potential detriment to our performance. You see, I'm also well-read, and so I knew the neurobiology. I knew that multitasking is a myth, that when we think we're multitasking, what we are in fact doing is switching rapidly between tasks, not doing either of them well. And so I chose not to try to do too much. Within a few seconds, by memory, I had taken the first 2 remedial actions that we would eventually get to on the checklist over a minute later, over a third of the way through the remaining flight time. But I needed those actions to be effective immediately and not to wait. I turned on the engine ignition so if the engines could recover, they would. And I started the airplane's auxiliary power unit. I knew it was only a matter of a few minutes before our flight path intersected the surface of the Earth. I had to choose the best possible place for that to happen. Having flown into New York many times, I knew that there were only 3 options. There were only 2 runways that might be reachable. It turned out with reaction time they were not. And the only other place in the entire New York metro area, one of the most densely developed areas on the planet where it might be possible to even try landing a large jet airliner, would be the Hudson River. I suspected early on that's where we would end up, but I knew I had to try to consider at least returning to a runway if it was possible. I took control of the aircraft, made one distress call, worked with the air traffic controller, considered returning to LaGuardia, decided it was unreachable, considered trying to reach the Teterboro Airport in New Jersey across the river, decided that was not reachable either. And I told the controller we're going to be in the Hudson. He told me later he was shocked in disbelief, and he assumed that by choosing that path that we would all perish. And it was an agonizing 45 minutes until he found out that everyone had survived. Our first officer, Jeff Skiles, couldn't have had a better colleague that day or since. In a situation where the time pressure and the workload were so intense, We didn't have time even to talk about what had happened and what we should do about it. He and I were able to collaborate wordlessly by knowing intuitively in this developing crisis what we should do to help the other based on our own long experience. Had Jeff not also had 20,000 hours of flying time like I did, had he not been a captain before, had he not been so experienced, he wouldn't have known either to do that or how to do that. So he made an important suggestion at several points in the flight. He was silently cheering me on as I made each decision, but ready to intervene to check my performance if he thought I was making an error. I had a chance to make only one announcement in the cabin, and before I made what I knew would be the most important PA announcement of my life, I took what was probably an extravagant amount of time, 3 or 4 seconds, to choose my words very carefully before I spoke. I wanted to sound confident, not agitated, because I knew that courage can be contagious. And I chose specific words for specific reasons. Fortunately, we have the advantage of having a very well-defined and very concise aviation vocabulary in which there are certain single words that are rich with meaning. Brace is such a word. It signals to the cabin crew, the flight attendants, that an emergency landing is imminent and that they should help the passengers avoid injury during the landing so they'll be able to evacuate by shouting their commands to the passengers. And in the spur of the moment, I chose another word to give the passengers and crew in the cabin alike a vivid image, a word picture of what to expect, that without engine thrust, we were using gravity to provide the forward motion of the airplane. We were descending the equivalent in a hotel elevator, descending at 2 floors per second. So I knew it was going to be a hard landing. I just didn't know how hard because Jeff and I had never practiced this before. So I chose the word impact to give them that vivid image. I said, this is the captain, brace for impact. And immediately, even through that armored cockpit door, I could hear the 2 flight attendants in front, Donna and Sheila, and I'm sure Doreen in the back was doing the same, begin shouting their commands in unison to the passengers. Brace, 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 heads down, stay down. Hearing those words that day encouraged me. It comforted me to know that by saying the few words I had, but choosing the right words, I had literally gotten my crew on the same page. And that if I could find a way to deliver this aircraft to the surface intact, it would